Hi, and welcome back to Weekly Dev Tips. I'm your host, Steve Smith, aka Ardalis. This is episode 54 on customizing key mappings in Visual Studio with guest Kendra Havens. This week's tip is brought to you by devBetter.com. If you need to level up your career, if you're looking for a mentor in the support of some motivated tech-savvy peers, then devBetter is a group coaching program I started last year. We meet for weekly group Q&A sessions. We have an ongoing private Slack channel, and I offer advice, networking opportunities, coding exercises, some marketing and branding tips, etc. If you're interested, check it out at devbetter.com. This week's guest tip is from Kendra Havens. Kendra is a program manager at Microsoft on the .NET and Visual Studio team, where she focuses on the Visual Studio testing experience and productivity tools, which, by the way, have gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. She does videos on .NET, VS Code, and Docker, and is a frequent conference presenter as well. In fact, we last met up at a recent Dev Intersection conference where we were both presenting, and I invited her to share a favorite tip on the podcast. The nature of describing a visual tool in a podcast is challenging, so I have a link to a video in the show notes if you want to follow up afterward. Welcome, Kendra.
Hello, I'm Kendra Havens, a program manager on .NET and Visual Studio. I mostly work on productivity and unit testing. So I am here to talk to you about the keyboard mapping in Visual Studio. So my biggest tip will be on the Visual Studio commands and the keyboard shortcuts that you can configure of them. Not many people know how flexible we actually are in that area. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the keyboard mapping scheme. So a lot of you might be familiar with your keyboard mapping scheme, so you can navigate there through your Tools Options environment keyboard. And most people have the default selected, obviously, but we also have keyboard mapping schemes for Visual Studio Code users. So if you find yourself switching often between two different coding environments, you can actually retain a lot of your muscle memory. We also have a ReSharper keyboard mapping scheme. So you can set those to your preference. Underneath the keyboard mapping scheme setting, we have a very long list of possible commands in Visual Studio that can be mapped to keyboard shortcuts. Many of these commands do not even have a mapping, so you might only be able to kind of find them in UI right now, but they are there for the folks who did want to kind of customize their environment and create that workflow that makes them really productive. So my absolute favorite one in this list is open folder in File Explorer. This is a command that can be accessed by right-clicking inside of the Solution Explorer, looking all the way down in your context menu towards the bottom, and you will have open folder in File Explorer. You do need a folder selected for this to actually be an option. So I did not find this command for years when I was using Visual Studio. I actually only found it a few months ago. And it is so helpful. Before this, I was definitely clicking on a file, opening the properties pane, copying out the path, opening my File Explorer. It was not super fun. So this command will actually open the containing folder in your directory on your drive. So the File Explorer is part of Windows outside of Visual Studio. And yeah, I am constantly wanting to do this. If I want to, run git status or git bash there, kind of use all kinds of commands there. In order to map this, all I needed to do was go to my Tools Options keyboard environment, or environment keyboard, there we go, and search for open folder in File Explorer. No spaces. We are very particular about the search in this area, so we do search on substring. So if you misspell anything or don't quite get the correct synonym or whatever for the command, it might not show up. So you might need to be a little bit creative because we were a bit too creative for how we named some commands in Visual Studio. We are working on making this search better. Hopefully we will get a fuzzy search in here and it'll accept spaces and do all kinds of combinations of better search flow. Anyway, so you search for the command you want, and once you select it, it'll show you what keyboard shortcuts are already mapped to this. And it'll show you that in the bottom right corner. So select your command and see if anything's already mapped to it. If nothing is mapped to it and you want to choose which keyboard shortcuts you want to hook up to this, a good way to know if those keyboard shortcuts are already mapped to something else is to, first off, unselect your command and then place your cursor in the Press Shortcut Keys box and type out the shortcut key. It will give you a drop-down list of all of the commands associated with that shortcut key. So you can kind of figure out what keys, are mapped. And this is really helpful because some keyboard shortcuts are only mapped in certain contexts. So like TFS will have keyboard shortcuts that are specifically only available when like Team Explorer is open, when Team Explorer has the focus in Visual Studio. So it's a good way to kind of make sure you're not stealing from another workflow that you just haven't discovered yet, and you don't want to be kind of tripping up by having non-default settings. Yeah, so it's a way to think ahead, I guess. So that'll show you what is currently mapped and what is not. And then you can just hit assign after you type those in to so you assign them to your favorite command. Great, so that is the tip that I had to share today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Kendra. I'll post a link to a video showing how to do this in the show notes for anyone who'd like to see it. That's it for this week. If you want to hear more from me, go to ardallas.com/tips to sign up for a free tip in your inbox every Wednesday. I'm also streaming programming topics on twitch.tv/ardallas most Fridays at noon Eastern Time. Thanks for subscribing to Weekly Dev Tips, and I'll see you next week with another great developer tip.